Welcome to the Poetry Project. Thank you all for being here to celebrate the incredible, iconic Ron Padgett tonight. It is an honor to welcome you. My name is Mira Narsaños. I am the program director at the Poetry Project. I started working here 6 months ago only. And I just wanted to say that I feel incredibly grateful to be working at the Poetry Project, and want to acknowledge also the legacy that made our work today possible. And it's thanks to incredible poets like Ron Padgett and so many of you also here tonight that we're able to do the work that we do today. So thank you for your ongoing contribution, because it's ongoing. As tonight we're celebrating this beautiful book by Ron Padgett called Pink Dust, published this year by the New York Review of Books. I would say grab a copy, but there are no copies left, unfortunately. Oh, there are more? Okay, great. So there are copies left. Not many, but you should definitely grab a copy if you haven't yet. I will turn it over to Anselm Berrigan, who will introduce Ron Padgett. Just a few announcements and reminders. There are 2 all-gender bathrooms at the Poetry Project, one on the first floor and an accessible bathroom on the ground floor. If you need to get there, let me or anyone else on staff know, and we'll escort you. We also have upcoming events, which I encourage you to attend. On Monday, we're celebrating our first ESB reading of the season with Angela Abiodun and Mahogany L. Brown. On Wednesday, we're celebrating the new translation of The Aesthetic of Resistance, Volume 3, translated by Joel Scott, who will be here, who will be in attendance. And on Friday, we have a discourse on debt with Adam Haj Yahya. And that's it for events. Also, if you haven't grabbed a copy of our 279th newsletter, I encourage you to do so. I know that the first edition ever published was created by Ron Padgett, and we are here at number 279. Continuing the legacy. Okay, I think that's it for me, and I will turn it over to my first poetry teacher ever, Anselm Berrigan. Thank you, Anselm.
Sorry, Ron, we missed the reception. I was hanging out with some of your bum-ass former students. And we just walked in the last minute or two, but we were thinking about you this whole time. Hey, audience. It's nice to see you. Poetry Project wrote me kind of like last week or the week before and said, hey, will you introduce Ron Padgett? I was like, that's the one thing you could ask me to do that I won't say no to. And it's a funny thing about introductions. You're supposed to get up and say a bunch of words before somebody gets up and then reads artworks made of words. That's weird. And I just remember that, like, when I was a kid, because I grew up in the same neighborhood that Ron and Pat live in, Ron was always kind of mean to me. It was like picking on me. So I just thought, okay, I'll do this introduction so I can get revenge. It wasn't particular stuff. It was just I'd be walking by, going to high school on 15th Street and 2 blocks away from where they lived, and I'd see Ron in his notebook being like, writing stuff, glaring at me. Like, you're too much like your dad. But I want to say actually that I knew Ron's poems much more that I knew him as a person up until a certain point. So I was reading Ron's poems when I was in my early 20s, when I actually just made the gigantic mistake to become a poet. And reading these amazing things, and then later got to know him as a person. And I just thought, there's something off about all of this. Like, I'm reading his first book, Great Balls of Fire, which has these beautiful poems in it. A little poem called December, right? I sleep in my little cup. Big Blue Jay composition. A poem called Wonderful Things, which ends with the lines, and that's what I want to tell you, wonderful things. I might be getting that quite wrong. Cut forward about 45 years, and I'm sitting in this room, and Ron's reading, and he's reading a poem called Fairy Tale, and at the very end of the poem, the lines go, I am an evil man, and tonight I will do evil things in this town. And I was sitting here with my friend John Coletti, who's a poet, and was a student of Ron's, and John and I became friends because Ron introduced us, and I actually have to say, I'm sorry to embarrass you, Ron, or not, that about several dozen of my longest standing close friendships have come from Ron introducing me to people. But John and I looked at each other. Everybody else was laughing at those lines, but we knew that shit was true. Ron was evil, and he'd been doing evil things in this city since the early 1960s. Among those evil things were, or are, being one of the inventors of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church, this place that you're at. That was pretty evil. And then one time I was director of the Poetry Project for a few years, and I wrote to Ron and I said, Ron, this job is crazy. Can I talk to you? And we met up, and I said, the NEA has cut our funding. The church to which we pay rent has just cut us off from their liability insurance. I don't know how to do this job. Ron said, I understand. But when I was director, there was a fire and the church nearly burned down. And then once we were able to get back in here, in this room, there was no floor. And me and Maureen Owen, after every reading, had to wipe all the ash and dust and dirt off all the chairs after every single reading that had taken place. And I thought, oh, okay, I can't complain about nothing. God damn. So that was another evil thing he did. I want to talk just briefly about, it's a funny thing about introductions because, 9 times out of 10, the best thing about introductions is that they end, right? Like, they shouldn't go on too long. Ron has done a ton of work for poetry, for teachers, for poets, for translators. His translations of Pierre Reverdy, Guillaume Apollinaire, Blaise Cendrars, among others, are out there. You should find them. If you were at the Guggenheim Museum for that Orphic painting show that was up for a few months, if you got up to the top, you got to hear Ron read some of his translations, mostly of Blaise Cendrars, but also 1 or 2 Apollinaire poems. It's a funny thing, that show, because the Orphic thing, Apollinaire just said, hey, these painters are Orphic. That was just a hustle. But Ron understood the hustle. My particular favorite books of Ron's include Triangles in the Afternoon, Little Red and Yellow, beautiful book done by Sun Books, Toujours l'Amour, also done by Sun Books. I think green and sort of off yellow. Big Cabin, How to Be Perfect. Then there's the collected poems, which is a big brick. Just throw that thing through a window. And as I mentioned, Great Balls of Fire. There's too many subjects in the work to just list. So I just want to say something about friendship. As you may or may not know, Ron Padgett has written memoirs of his friends, their lives. Joe Brainerd, my father, Ted Berrigan. I appreciate the fact that, Ron, that when you came into San Francisco in, I think, 1994 and read from the memoir of Ted that had just come out, that in that reading you left out all the parts about how difficult he was. And a book that I think has just come out today that's a memoir of Dick Gallup's life and poetry. And then over here, wherever this is, there's the memoir biography of his father called Oklahoma Tough. And I just want to say, it will never leave me, this image or memory or just something that comes out of words of Ron being a teenager in Tulsa, which I've been to. That's a rough place. Reading surrealist poetry and comic books while his father's being a bootlegger because Tulsa didn't go let alcohol be legal again until like the late 50s. That's a friendship too. And that's a beautiful book and also a very interesting piece of history. Oh, I have to say Ron was a chancellor, the Academy of American Poets, for a few years. That's evil. I mean, it's not, but you can say it is if you're standing here. And well, the whole point of an introduction is to say a bunch of nice things and get out of the fucking way. So, Ron, please come up and read. It's my pleasure to introduce you.
Gosh, well... Thank you, Anselm. And I want to thank the Poetry Project people who are still running this place for inviting me. And I want to thank all of you for coming, especially those people who are stalwart enough to stand in the back. Wow. Thank you. Last night I was doing some math. Can you hear me back there okay? Bill, can you hear me? No, you can't? I can't hear a word you say. Oh, go home. Oh, yeah, thank you. That's better, right? Oh, yeah. I was doing some math last night, and I realized that I gave my first reading at the Poetry Project 58 years ago. And no. And I was kind of stunned. I kept redoing it in my head, and 58 years ago. And then I thought, what does that mean? And I realized it means absolutely nothing, except that I'm old, for one thing. But I couldn't extract anything intrinsically wonderful about it, except the strangeness of it. Well, anyway, enough of that. I'm going to read in two sets tonight, with, I hope, a very short break between them, and they're about half an hour each. And And the second half, I am going to read poems from my new book that New York Review of Books has published and done so well. So that will be the second half. But the first half, I want to read from another book that Anselm referred to, I think. It's a memoir of my friend Dick Gallup, and that has just been published by Cuneiform Books. So I'm going to start with that, and have a short break, and then read poems. So this is from, the book is called Dick, a memoir of Dick Gallup. Why this book? In the commentary on the so-called Tulsa School of Poetry, Ted Berrigan, Joe Brainerd, Dick Gallup, and me, Dick remained, even while he was alive, a somewhat recessive, shadowed, mysterious presence in the background. This vague impression of him, a result of his reluctance to put himself forward as a personality, and his eventual withdrawal from the poetry world, these things continued into his posthumous life. His death not only removed his physical presence from the world, it also signaled to me the beginning of the erasure of the very memory of him, except among those who knew and admired him. As his lifelong friend, I was unable to bear the thought of the effacement of such an extraordinary person and poet. I hope in this book to give him the credit he deserves for his books and for the powerful influence he had on Ted Berrigan and me as people, as well as writers, as well as on the other writers and artists who knew how good he was. It's time to bring Dick Gallup into the limelight where he belongs. Don't worry, I'll get the hang of this microphone in just a minute. These are just excerpts. And boy, is this a hard book to excerpt, I'll tell you. Anyway, the new kid on the block walked across the street to the front yard where another boy was playing with a toy truck and said, "Hi, I'm Dickie." And the boy said, "I'm Ronnie." Thus began our 70-year friendship. The Dick Gallup's family had just moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma from Greenfield, Massachusetts. The Gallup family found Tulsa emotionally dislocating, but at the same time rather exotic. Dick later recalled, "We had never seen a Southern Baptist." On more than one occasion, he told me how wonderful it had been to be a child in Greenfield. His family had lived about a mile outside of town at 144 Shelburne Road in the two-story New England farmhouse where he was born. Nearby was a wood with a stream where he spent many happy hours on his own, just wandering around, looking at things, and daydreaming. He was particularly fond of his maternal grandfather, who lived nearby and whom Dick visited often after school. And Dick later wrote about his grandfather, "My grandfather's virtues were humility, compassion above all, curiosity, and empathy. He gave me strength." For Dickie, leaving Greenfield was a bit like being expelled from the Garden of Eden. But he did enjoy the long, exciting train trip to Tulsa, the roomette, the dining car, the towns, and the ever-changing landscape flowing past. Dick and I had fairly, well, not exactly conventional childhoods, but we did boy things. We played sports, we goofed around, we went to the movies, we rode our bicycles up and down the street, things like that. But at a certain point, beginning in junior high, we began to develop rather strangely. And around the age of 14, Dick and I invented something we called blapping. To blap someone, you gently slap them with the palm of your hand on their upper chest while saying, slowly and thickly, like a long belch, "Blap." We never tried to blap anyone but each other. Doing it successfully required stealth and surprise, and the blappee invariably burst out in mock horror, exclaiming, "Oh, I've been blapped!" There was only one person in my life to whom I could say, "Halito chinchikima," and know he would understand me. As children, Dick and I had learned this sentence from Native American artist A.C. Blue Eagle on his local television show. It means, "Hello, how are you?" in Cherokee. At least that's what he told us it meant. We went to a lot of movies together. In Tulsa, children could just go to the movies without being molested and things. Yeah. But one unforgettable moment, a cinematic moment, came in the film Rio Bravo, when John Wayne approaches what looks like an abandoned house and calls out the villain's name, Burdette, Nathan Burdette. Something in that moment struck Dick and me as hilarious. 50 years later, I phoned Dick, and after he said hello, I said, Burdette, Nathan Burdette, and he and I were transported into movie heaven. Not all our movie experiences were enjoyable. Dick was so terrified by the face of the actor Victor Jory, particularly his eyes, that when Jory came on the screen in the film The Fugitive Kind, Dick got up and fled the theater. In junior high school, Dick and I became rabid fans of science fiction, particularly the work of Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein. Reading science fiction whisked us into other books where we found Einstein, Greek gods, Plato, Homer, Dickens, and Shakespeare. It was Dick who took the leap into Romeo and Juliet. Competitive kid that I was, I read it right after he did. I couldn't let him get ahead of me. It was the same for a book by a man named W. McNeill Dixon called Preface to Philosophy, which Dick bought in a used bookstore in Tulsa around 1957. After he read it, I bought it from him and read parts of it, ultimately suspecting that he had gotten a lot more from it than I had. I wonder what effect this book had on our young sensibilities, with sentences such as, quote, "An ugly day it must have been when the first man stood face to face with the idea of the worthlessness and absurdity of life." George Gamow's popular book, 1, 2, 3, Infinity, brought a whole new set of ideas to us. Gamow, a brilliant scientist, was good at presenting difficult concepts to the lay audience. I think it was Gamow who introduced us to the elusive idea of infinity. The question was tantalizing. How could anything exist without having a limit? It might have been Gamow also who offered a simplified example of relativity. A person standing in the aisle of a moving train drops a ball, whose trajectory, from the person's point of view, is straight down. But from the point of view of a person watching the train go by, its trajectory could be plotted as diagonal. Obviously, both observations are valid. Suddenly, this simple example pervaded our thinking. A dog looks gigantic to an ant, but small to a giraffe. Napoleon was a hero to some, but a monster to others. Helping an old person across a busy street is an act of kindness to a human, but it is nothing to a tree. Thus, our childish view of the world, inner and outer, was broken up and rearranged in a mass of constantly shifting panels, a sort of intellectual cubism. Dick's interest in interstellar space became evident when we were in junior high school. From an advertisement in the magazine Sky and Telescope, I bought a simple, gangly $20 telescope that allowed us to peer deeper into the night sky. We named it the Tripus, as setting up its tripod legs was like wrestling with an octopus. Suddenly, the moon was not only beautiful, it was astounding. And look, that red thing, it's Mars. We spent many chilly nights in my front yard gazing up at Orion, which arose in the south above Dick's rooftop. And we documented our interstellar forays by drawing our own star maps, color-coded to indicate the magnitude of each star, even though commercial star maps were available. At some point, Dick and I stretched a string across the street from my bedroom window to his. And at each end, we connected an empty Campbell's soup can, in the bottom of which we had punched a small hole through which we inserted the string and secured it with a shirt button. To our surprise, this crude device actually worked. We could talk to each other as if by phone. Anytime a car came down the street, we would let the string go slack and it would drop to the pavement. One day, though, we didn't notice a speeding car whose hood ornament snagged the string and violently yanked the cans from our grasp. The cans shot into the sides of the car with loud bangs. The car screeched to a halt. The driver jumped out, furiously shouting, "What the hell is going on? Who did this?" He pounded on the Gallup's front door. Our mothers made us come out of hiding and apologize. Over the years, Dick and I chortled at the thought of that guy's ranting and raving. When Dick and I were in 9th and 8th grades, respectively, we formed a self-improvement club with a fellow named Lauren Owen, who had been an elementary school classmate of Dick's. We called our club The Three, and we went so far as to establish written bylaws. Each club meeting had 3 parts: instructional, it was called a symposium, athletic, called gymnasium, and culinary, eat. Every Saturday, we met at one of our houses to give each other assignments, present the previous week's work, and then go outside to engage in some sports activity, and then go back indoors to consume the snack the host mother had prepared for us. Now, during these sessions, Dick turned in mostly essays, such as a brief one called "The Advantages of Travel by Hyperspace." And here's how it starts. The force field. Remember, this kid is 14. The force field, it will be called a force field for convenience, but it is actually lines which tend to attract motion. That is, that an object tends to move on these, and that the only way it can stop from moving on them is to exceed the speed of light, a theoretical impossibility. Now, back then, a lot of kids were imagining space travel, but how many of them would come up with the idea that there are lines that attract motion? In the 9th grade, Dick, at the age of 14, developed a crush on Madeline Grove, a classmate of mine, whom he first noticed at a school dance at the VFW in March of 1956. A few years later, Dick wrote a kind of a Kerouac-inspired account of his meeting her, and this following description of what happened. And I'll quote from this piece that Dick wrote. He wasn't much older, 16 or 17. Here's what he said about that. The night was cold and the snow was on the ground, but inside the VFW building the air was warm and you could smell all the bright, pretty girls, all 13 or 14 young, with small, young bodies. Later, I started to dance with this girl that I had very rarely noticed before, only in passing, because she was very shy and always kept out of the light. But still, I sought her out unconsciously and started to dance with her then. Now, she was a very beautiful girl, tall and thin, with beautiful black hair and the greatest green eyes that were engulfed and engulfing in large, dark sockets. But I looked over at her once, and she smiled at me rather nervously out of her oval face. This, I think, more or less because she didn't know what to think, because she was so naive, as was I. And really, this was the whole problem. Later, neither of us knew what the other was thinking, and so the world fell in. But then, everything was, to me, much brightness and happy, and I wanted to take her in my arms and tell her that I loved her, and kiss her softly and make love to her. She almost knowing this and was afraid, but I didn't know this and thought she meant by her smile, come on, let's fall in love. Then I danced with her all the time and forever saying very little and just holding her close and letting her body melt into mine and not getting an erection or anything, but feeling with my soul against her body, feeling with my soul her body against mine and feeling her breasts in their smallness against my breast and feeling the pressure of her thighs against mine. All of this meaning so much to me. And then I realized just how lonely I was and how much I wanted to communicate with someone. And so the night passed, and I put her hand against my breast so she could hear my heartbeat, and she thus knowing. All the while I danced with her, I thought vaguely of lightly kissing her and loving her so tenderly, not knowing how hopeless it was to become. Dick's early penchant for math and science had been supplemented by his growing attraction to literature and history. In college, he graduated from high school and public high school in Tulsa, and then he went to Tulane University. In college, one of his favorite classes was called Western Civilization, taught by a professor who emphasized the value of relating ancient history to contemporary history. Dick was always interested in how ideas evolved from one culture or another through time. He was still writing about it as late as 2003. Alongside his study of ancient history was his interest in ancient Greek. He would become so immersed in it that if he read Homer late at night, he couldn't fall asleep. And later, many years later, in an interview, he said, I had a theory that the Greeks and Romans could think more logically than we can, because of the syntax of their languages, though our own, being uninflected, is more open. But there's something to be said for being precise, like Cicero. Despite the occasionally peripatetic life he led after leaving Tulane, he never left behind his cherished Liddell and Scott Greek dictionary, his books on Greek syntax, scholarly editions of Homer, and other ancient Greek texts. So Dick he had known Ted Berrigan back in Tulsa. I'll get to that in a minute. But in June of 1961, Dick wrote this untitled poem, that we go about in our own heart's way, that the will of others does not touch us, that lingering in our own spirit we say that it is good, the nearness the close calling for us. Shortly afterward, going his own heart's way, he left Tulane and he headed to New York City for the summer, where he stayed in a Lower East Side basement apartment with Ted Berrigan. It was a dark one-room space that connected to a kitchen they shared with their subterranean neighbor, the building superintendent, a scrawly old fellow named Willie, who periodically complained that somebody's been eating my cornflakes. The building at 5 Willett Street in the Lower East Side, it no longer exists. The only charm of the place was the sound of a cantor singing in the synagogue next door, though the atmosphere was brightened when Ted's girlfriend from Tulsa, Pat Mitchell, joined them. For relief from the summer heat, the three of them would go for late-night walks on the nearby Williamsburg Bridge, where they sometimes heard a guy with obvious talent playing jazz saxophone. Years later, they learned it was Sonny Rollins. Meanwhile, Dick was starting to talk more and more like Ted, which was to happen to a number of Ted's future acolytes. But Ted, in subtler ways, was being influenced by Dick as well. Dick's cast of mind was interesting and original, and he would often reply to Ted's assertions with an unexpected take of his own. It's quite telling how often Dick's name pops up in the poems Ted wrote in the early 1960s, especially in his book, The Sonnets. Beginning in Tulsa in 1959, Dick grew closer and closer to Ted. Although not yet the Ted Berrigan he became in New York, he was already charismatic, an expansive Irish-American conversationalist who tended to take younger people under his wing and advise them at length about life and literature. In the late 1950s, Ted's brain was charged with ideas and enthusiasms, even when it wasn't energized by amphetamine. Dick, Joe Brainerd, and I were among the first young people to be charmed by this Pied Piper. Two others were Ted's 8th grade students at the parochial school where he was teaching. And one of them was a girl named Christine Murphy, who's the Chris of his sonnets. At the time, Ted was also obsessing over his master's thesis, called The Problem of How to Live, as dealt with in 4 plays by George Bernard Shaw. At that point in Dick's life, the problem of how to live was central, and he found in Ted someone who, if he couldn't help him figure things out fully, at least offered an exit from his present circumstances. For myself, I admired and respected Ted a lot, but from the start, something made me push back against his influence, albeit gently. Dick's usual reaction to Ted was not to resist, but, when necessary, as he put it, I go out the back door. Early on in their relationship, Dick accepted Ted's sometimes harsh lecturing as simply part of his cathartic method. I, as someone who always wanted to feel in control of situations, saw it as hectoring, though I knew full well that Ted was perceptive in ways I wasn't. By 1962, Ted's gravitational pull on Dick had begun to lose its force, though they remained good friends, and in subsequent years, Ted continued to deliver both encouragement and the kind of blunt criticism that only a friend can get away with, as noted by Dick. And here's something Dick wrote in his journal in 1965. Time to mention a few nasty comments by Ted, which, as usual, have their grain of truth. I was thinking yesterday that Ted has a certain type of perception which makes his remarks on about anything brilliant, but always wrong. Don't worry, I say nice things about Ted in the book too. So Dick he dropped out of Tulane, he moved to New York, and then he re-enrolled at Columbia. And he became a very important part of the early days of the Poetry Project here in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s. He did a lot of readings here. He taught a workshop. He published. He helped collate. He was part of this community in a very important part. And I'm going to now read you an excerpt from his diary. Let's see, when is this? January of 1968. It's an excerpt. To give you an idea about the kind of feeling there was in this neighborhood and around the Poetry Project then. Dick said, I was just over to the church, St. Mark's, helping Ron, Anne Waldman, and Peter Sheldall run off Mike Brownstein's new book, Behind the Wheel. They had only 4 pages done when I had to leave, it being midnight, etc. Actually, I spent a great deal of time today, Sunday, gadding around to everyone's house. First, I took Christina, his little girl, to dig the snow, and then we went to Ron's. He said he was going over to Ted's to get the cover for Mike's book and watch a little football. So off we went and met David Shapiro coming down the street with Larry Weiner. They had a car. Wow. And we got out of the freezing cold, 20s with 30-mile-per-hour winds, and went over to Ted's. Quickly we left them, Ted just getting up, breakfast time, and went to the Victory Deli for hot dogs. Back to Ron's for coffee, and George Schneemann wandered in from the cold. I tried to convince him to come down to play a game of chess, but he chose to remain in the warmth of Ron's apartment and play chess with Ron. I came home then and ate dinner, played with Christine, and read some more awful poetry. And at 10 p.m., I went over to Peter's and ate dinner again. Wonderful. And just as we finished, Ron came in to pick up the paper for Mike's book, sitting in Peter's dining room, and to pick us up, as it turned out. And so I'm back home again at 12:30 in the a.m., eating social tea, biscuits, and drinking Pepsi. Saturday night, we went to a party at Kenward Elmsley's house, a 12th night party. We saw all the old folks of New York literature, Kenneth Koch, John Ashbery, Kenward, Jimmy Schuyler, etc. And this is an excerpt from Dick's diary in January of 1970. This week in my Poetry Project workshop, I told the students to write a poem which has a rationale, an internal logic, which would be strict enough that if I asked them why a certain word or line was in the poem, they could give me an answer. Thinking myself, I come to the conclusion that one must be able to write a poem as strict as that, a good poem that is. In this sense, poetry is a matter of hard work, developing the ability to follow a line of thought through a kind of poetic logic, which is always personal in nature, but which must somehow be made to come across by the language you use to other people who do not share your own logic. I suppose you could say this is a problem of getting them to identify with the poem, by one means or another, getting people to partake of your own logical structure. The means of doing this are usually more evident than the actual thoughts conveyed. It comes out as technique. Hence, Larry Fagan gets us into his poems by being coy and laconic. Ron operates by wit, strange juxtapositioning, and dry humor. Ted, by alternately shouting at the top of his voice and whispering tenderly, a sort of poetic interrogation team. Kenward Elmsley uses grace plus strange conglomerates of sound which set one another off beautifully. Kenneth Koch uses blinding wit, usually in conjunction with verbal pyrotechnics. John Ashbery uses a sly under and over statement, his form of wit, together with an elegance of logical construction that no one can match. Jimmy Schuyler uses lyrical grace and simplicity. All these are forms of aesthetic beauty in the sense that they attract the reader. It's like the carrot held out to the rabbit that I've always seen as so obvious in Shakespeare, a sort of con game of appearances to get the reader in a place where you can blow his mind. I think that anyone who has given many readings of poetry will see the truth of this. So much of a reading is manipulation of the audience, gaining their confidence so that they will not resist you when you twist their minds a bit. That's the end of the quote. These comments suggest that Dick's poetry writing was largely a heavy-duty analytical process. But one year later, in another diary entry, he describes his writing in a way that might make it seem quite different. He says, "I go out there where it's lonely and beautiful and dangerous." But the seeming contradiction is illusory. His poetry is a striking blend of cerebral control and the adventuresome out there. Sometimes he went so far out there, he wasn't sure what he was doing. And he says in another diary entry, "Often enough, my new poems look like Chinese to me." But he knew that it was the right thing to do. I can't resist then. I'm probably going on too long, but I'm only going to read two more entries from this book. This little section is called "The Eyeball in London." And the thing described took place about, when was it, 1970, I think. Let me see here. Yeah, 1970. I had put Dick in touch with Jim Dine, who at the time was living in London, and Jim swiftly took him to a party at Rory McEwen's. Rory was a Scottish aristocrat, artist, folk musician, and TV host based in London who traveled the world in pursuit of folk music. He was one of the most delightful people I have ever known. He was warm, kind, well-mannered, socially generous, smart, modest, and talented, with a fine sense of humor and an amazing range of experience. A real pleasure to be with. Among Rory's many friends, in addition to Jim Dine, were notables such as George Harrison, Ravi Shankar, Peter Sellers, Cy Twombly, Jonathan Miller, the Queen of Bhutan, and members of the British royal household. But Rory was not a collector of celebrities. He was a friend of anyone who interested him, even unknowns such as Dick and me. Anyway, Dick described going to this party at Rory McEwen's. I just looked on in astonishment. It was the fucking well-born set. Aristocrats. Plus the usual hustlers, freaks, etc. And some people, too. Good grief. There I was, surrounded by incredible scenes, with only Jim Dine between me and a sophisticated social scene about 5 miles above anything in New York for pure social style. I listened to the music and watched people for a while, and then got into things a bit. And then Princess Margaret came in. Really. She was very dowdy, and she was it. That made things sort of weird, toned things down. Finally, as she was leaving, Princess Margaret put her glasses down on a coffee table in front of me and gave me an incredible look as she stood up by the crystal balls, orbs of state. Wow. I said, "Hello." Later, I asked Dick what she had said back to him. Nothing. She just gave me the regal eyeball. And this is the last excerpt I'll read from this book. The excerpt, the little chapter is very short. It's called "Building a House," just one paragraph. It's not simply that Dick and I were such close friends. At a crucial point, early in our adolescence, we began to develop back and forth off each other, as if our psyches were staircases we were building together, one of us adding a tread and the other adding the next tread, and so on. Without our friendship, neither he nor I would have become who we turned out to be. for better or worse. I do know that at this very moment, His Spirit lives in me. Not only as a memory of a lifelong spiritual brother, but also an actual part of me. Some of Him has written this book. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you don't mind if we take a very short break so I can sit down for a minute and get in another mood. And then I'll read poems for the book, okay? Thank you. I took my jacket off because it was starting to get warm, but then I realized I will actually look a little different too, and that's probably a good idea because I've noticed on a lot of packaging of products you buy in the supermarket or wherever, a lot of companies have been saying on their products, they say, same great product, great new look. Like toothpaste, it's a big deal that the toothpaste tube looks different. So I feel a little bit like a tube of toothpaste up here. Anyway. Okay, I'm going to read now from this book, Pink Dust. They're mostly short poems, a lot of them, but most of them don't have titles. Every time I approach a blank page, the poems in it shout, "Oh no, here he comes again. Run!" I grab at them as they flee, like terrified little bugs. Gotcha. There used to be an eraser in the shape of a wheel, pink, attached to a little brush, black, for erasing pencil words and then brushing away the residue, a little pink dust, though I preferred to brush it away with my hand or to puff up my cheeks and blow it away. I'd like to replay all those moments in my life, one after the other, in a film to be called A History of Pink Dust. Wasn't it the Bible that said, "Blessed art thou among women"? I'm taking those words for myself, as I am blessed, nay, blessed, to be in a house with one of them, the most beautiful old woman in the world. There is nothing more beautiful than a beautiful old woman. This is called And Where It Lands. When I was 10 years old, I set up a target in our backyard. And from the front yard, I shot arrows over the roof. You'd be surprised how quickly a kid can get good at it. This was a skill that later served me well when I faced the challenges of adult life. It helped me never to become a dolt. George Schneemann would not eat a lobster. They're too noble, he said. It's like eating a prehistoric creature. That was the real George, angular in thought and unapologetic. If you think he was odd, I don't want to know you. Go eat a lobster. Robert Creeley. A few years before his death, Robert Creeley gave a reading of his poetry at the Maison de l'Amérique latine in Paris. And near the end of it, he said, "Now I'm going to read some new work, all of it plain old doggerel." It was. As he read, he seemed half amused, half embarrassed. I cringed with a weird delight. It was the most avant-garde thing I had seen in a long time. The people gave each other furtive looks. Recently, I wrote a poem that said that making scones was a good thing to do. It could not have been more commonplace. The first poems I remember reading came from books like Best Loved Poems of the American People. The gingham dog and the calico cat side by side on the table sat. But there is no joy in Mudville, mighty Casey has struck out. And then one about the cremation of a man named Sam McGee. I was around 13. I thought some of them were pretty good. And the road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor. Terrific. But what's a moor exactly? I see Bob's face in that moonlight. He taps with his whip on the shutters. A brief guide to 20th century American poetry. Pound was a verb, Eliot a noun. They sentenced us to modernity. Williams was a definite article. Stevens, what? Stein was a paragraph, and then a paragraph. Stein, a paragraph. I mean, a wall. Guess what? I still like them all. As a young man, I wanted to live a long time so I could know what it feels like to be old. Now, I'm trying to remember what it feels like to be young. Young, old, old, young. Do you need more proof of how ridiculous I am? If so, look inside yourself, for you are just like me. There is nothing more ridiculous than a human being. The rest of nature doesn't know this. It's our little secret. I'm sure I'm not the only person my age who is still asking the same questions about existence that I asked in adolescence. But sometimes, when I look at the faces of people my age, all I see are loaves of bread, smiling, as if baking had been a great pleasure. Sex can continue into old age in various ways, a fact that no one wants to talk about. But it's interesting, much more than the sex of youth, which has so much force, it can't be interesting. It's like being hit in the head with a hammer. Sex in old age is more like being covered with warm snow by an angel who pretends to be blushing, radiant with joy. In memory of Dick Gallup, you have a cup of tea and take a nap for eternity, which, as my very old grandmother once said with a strange gleam in her eye, Eternity is a very long time. It didn't take long to drink that cup of tea, that poor little cup of tea. Forever enough. I put some stamps on the envelope. Maybe enough. I don't know. The post office should accept it as is, because I made an effort. The post office should look at the envelope and say, well, he made an effort. If I were living alone, there wouldn't be enough people in the house. Just as a house without doorways has something missing. A world without people would be okay, though. In fact, I think it would be wonderful. Everything would be a fact. I like that. Dare to express your inner self in the privacy of your own mind, but please don't think other people want to hear it. There are too many other inner selves to keep track of as it is. Instead, express your outer self. Just stand there. I noticed a black thing, a crumb of chocolate cake, a single mouse dropping, and for a moment, I didn't want it to be there, on my desk, so I flicked it off and onto the floor. Now, it's down there. Wonder what it is. Snow falling from gray sky, it's time to bake. Scones, I mean. And right out of the oven, take one and butter it with jam, teapot hot at hand, and exult in the face of everything horrible. Humans are barred from bug consciousness. Worse things have happened. Better ones, too. Bug climbs up window pane, turns right. I don't think that cherry is as red as it should be. In fact, it's jet black, like paint in a Manet, but as delicious as a cherry that is deep red and ready to float out into your hands. That's what happens when you love art enough and just stand there long enough to become an imbecile. Seven by 5 by 2 inches equals 70 cubic inches. The concise Oxford Dictionary. 1,552 pages of astonishment. Until your mind shatters into a million pieces, you who at 14 read a book called 30 Days to a More Powerful Vocabulary and thought, hey, this is a snap, this language. A snap of the fingers, and here you are, 63 years later, holding 70 cubic inches that hold you in their embrace. I just took out a ruler and measured the dictionary that I had guessed was 7 by 5 by 2 inches. And guess what? It was. I banged the ruler on the desk and called out, yes, yes, yes. Ah, the small, sad pleasure of being right. When my granddaughter saw me today, a smile lit up her face, and my face opened up too, with a smile that said, "I love you," and she knew. Then we looked away and became slightly somebody else. I tune into the music station, but when I walk away, it goes buzzy again, like in the uncertainty principle. Do you know what that is? It's a wonderful thing. It says you can't measure anything accurately because the act of measuring something changes it, or something like that. Like when you start to think about eternity, it moves away from you just beyond your grasp, which is a major accomplishment for something so big it can't be measured. Two more. There's nothing like a house seen from outside, lights on in the dark winter night, to make you feel close to all the humans inside that house and out. Pretty great to love humanity, if only for a moment. And last poem. There aren't many more pages in this notebook. I'll be sorry when they run out of emptiness. There can't be many more years to my life. Boo-hoo. I'll go on to a new notebook, hopefully one without metaphors. Don't get me wrong, I like metaphors, quite a lot. In fact, I live in one, a book. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ron, for this incredible reading. Thank you, Anselm, for your equally incredible introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. I also want to thank the Poetry Project staff working tonight, Nicole, Heather, Anna, as well as our techs, James and Matt, as well as all our volunteers working tonight who are big fans of Ron Padgett. Please come back to the Poetry Project and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.